On behalf of the OOIDA Foundation, we would like to welcome you to this session of OOIDA's Business Education Series of online training. This series is the most comprehensive series of business education that has been designed exclusively for the professional truck driver. There are a lot of drivers who are really good at driving a truck, but struggle to make a living in the industry. With these presentations, we're trying to help the drivers who excel at operating a truck understand how to be a successful business person. This education series is intended to help drivers navigate the business side of the trucking industry by providing an accessible and relevant introduction to the management principles of operating a successful trucking business. We would also like to congratulate the thousands of attendees who have taken part in this series. Your overwhelming response has helped to ensure that these programs will continue into the future. Hello, and welcome to this session of OOIDA's online education programming. My name's Tom Gann, and I'll be your host for this series, which covers the drug and alcohol regulation as it applies to professional truckers. This regulation is obviously too complex to cover in one session, so we've decided to break it down into 4 programs, each approximately 30 minutes in length. In Part 1 of this series, we cover who's responsible for what in the drug testing process. In Part 2, we talk about the different types of tests and the chain of custody. In Part 3, we identify the drugs that drivers are tested for, and we also discuss the ins and outs of alcohol testing. And in Part 4, we talk about how the test results are reported, we talk about the return to duty process, and we talk about the consequences that drivers may face if they try to get out of or try to cheat the testing process. For this program, Part 1, I've asked Amber Schwer and Rachel Aycock to join me. That's right, we've got the ladies in the house. Both Rachel and Amber have been with the OOIDA Business Services Department for more than 10 years, and more specifically, they're associated with the OOIDA Drug Consortium, CMCI. I've asked them both to stop by and help us get a handle on who's responsible for what. With the current drug and alcohol regulations, sometimes it's pretty confusing. It's like the current regulation has created a whole village of people who have different responsibilities for the various steps required to stay compliant. For instance, drivers, whether they're a hired driver, they're leased to a motor carrier, or if they're running under their own authority, each of them have varying responsibilities that can't be ignored. Then there's the motor carrier. Even if they're a one-truck operation, they're responsible for creating a written company policy, and they're also responsible for maintaining a drug and alcohol compliance file for every driver who drives for them. And they're going to be audited to make sure that they're living up to those responsibilities. Nowadays, there's a D.E.R. and an M.R.O. and a S.A.P. They all have responsibilities that will determine if the driver is compliant or not. And then, of course, there's the Drug Consortium itself. A lot of people don't know this, but there are 2 different types of drug consortiums. One type takes on more responsibility in the compliance process than the other one does, which can make life a lot simpler for the driver. We've got a lot of ground to cover in Part 1 of this series on drug and alcohol regulations, so let's get started. You know, a lot of people ask us about the drug consortiums and why we have to have those. And, you know, when we look back in the late 80s, especially the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a big issue with drivers who were doing whatever it took to get the load delivered. And what I'm talking about was, you know, drivers get paid by the mile, and so they had pressure, whether it was pressure from a shipper or just financial pressures. They would do whatever it took to get those miles in, and a lot of times that meant too much coffee, any kind of stimulant at all, and quite frankly, it also meant abuse of drugs. And we had people out on the road that just shouldn't have been on the road. I'm not saying that all truck drivers were that way, but there were those few out there that were doing that. The government stepped in, tried to make the roads safer for everybody. Amber, could you tell us a little bit about when they did that and kind of what was going on with that?
Of course. Back in 1991, Congress stepped in. They passed what they call the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 91.
No, wait a minute. What was the name of it?
The Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991.
Nobody ever calls it by its right name. It's just called the Drug Act.
Right. And the reason they did that was they noticed that there was several safety concerns. There was a lot of accidents, things like that out on the road. So they wanted to kind of enact something to try to help prevent that or kind of help figure out what was going on.
And quite frankly, driver health was an issue too.
Yes, very much so. And then later on in 94, they decided to introduce alcohol testing requirements to that act as well.
So the original act was just drug.
Correct.
And then later on they brought in alcohol. You know, we don't confuse people. Even today, we call it drug and alcohol, but quite frankly, you can be called in for a drug test, you can be called in for an alcohol test, or it could be both.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so we've passed this law and I've got to go in for a drug test. Can I just go in anytime I want? You know, like every 6 months? How often do I have to go in?
Unfortunately, no, you can't pull yourself for a random. That's the responsibility of the consortium that you're with. The consortium is the entity that is responsible for making the randoms, hitting the percentages, pulling 25% of their entire pool for drugs. The way that they notify of a random is depending on the consortium, but it's typically either through a phone call or through the mail and notice that you were chosen for the random. That's the only way a random is considered a verified and valid random. You have to be picked by a consortium, and the way the consortiums pull their numbers, they have to pull the 25% evenly spaced out throughout the year.
Okay. Consortiums have to pull 25% of their members every year, but they have to do it at various times during the year. So that's why some guys might get pulled once, twice, maybe 3 times during a year, while other drivers may go years without ever being pulled.
Yes, that's correct.
And the way that they do that is actually a computer-generated numbers program. They have each one of the participants in the program assigned an individual number, or it could be an employee ID, or it could be a social, and they take their random chances or their even chances of being pulled.
Okay, so I have 2 questions here. First off, how do you find a consortium? Is that a government thing, or is it just everybody who works together? Is it a company type thing?
Consortiums can be found all over through regular means of advertising. You can go on the internet and check it out. You can
Landline Magazine.
Landline Magazine, yep. OOIDA actually has a consortium as well called CMCI. Basically, a consortium for owner-operators that have their own authority that can't hold the requirements of pulling 25% of one individual person.
Now, you just mentioned owner-operators with their own authority. What if I'm leased to a motor carrier?
If you're leased to a motor carrier, most likely the motor carrier already has a program like that in place. Larger motor carriers that have multiple drivers typically run their consortiums in-house, and that's totally fine to do. It's not required that it be a separate entity from the actual motor carrier. They still have to follow all the same requirements and the regulations in the FMCSA book.
So if I've got a commercial driver's license, I have to belong to a consortium, whether it's through the motor carrier or I go out and join one of my own.
Correct.
Okay, and you talked about those random generated numbers. So I can't just, if I've got 4 or 5 drivers driving for me, I just can't throw all their names in a coffee can and pull one out?
Unfortunately, no. It's got to be a scientifically computer-generated number program that you use. That is the most fairest way, or I guess that's most fairest, the most fair way to make sure everybody takes their even chances of being pulled for a random. Just being eligible to be chosen for a random is actually what keeps you in compliance. All right, just to be very clear, the requirements are this. Basically, a driver who holds a CDL and the truck is over 26,000 pounds, either loaded or unloaded, is required to be in some kind of a random drug and alcohol testing pool. If you hold the CDL and the truck you drive is over 26,000 pounds, if you're an owner-operator, you can't meet the federal requirements of pulling 25% of yourself to take a random drug screen. That's where the consortium comes into play. As an owner-operator, you're thrown into a pool. 15 to 16,000 other owner-operators just like yourself, and you take your even chance of being chosen throughout the year for a random drug and or alcohol test. Basically, the definition of a consortium is a pooling or a gathering of like-minded people for the same ultimate purpose. It's a $10 word for a very small thing, but it's actually just a group of people that are trying to accomplish the same thing.
Now, we keep talking about owner-operator, but by the definition you gave us just a second ago, even a company driver would have to submit to random drug testing, right?
Correct.
But the company sets that up. So the driver, he's really not responsible for going out and finding his own consortium.
Exactly. It is the motor carrier's responsibility.
And on that note, if you are leased on to a motor carrier, it is that motor carrier's responsibility to make sure that they've got you covered and you're in their program.
Okay, so if I'm a company driver, the company's they're going to have their own consortium or get it set up. If I'm leased to a motor carrier, it's the motor carrier's responsibility to make sure everyone leased to him is in a consortium, and they normally have it set up.
Correct.
But if I'm an owner-operator running under my own authority, I'm totally responsible. I have to go out and find my own consortium.
Yes.
Since they passed this law, it's like they've created a whole village of people who are responsible for this drug testing piece. And so let's talk just a little bit about that. We kind of mentioned the driver, but the driver has some responsibilities, don't they, Amber?
Of course they do. The driver responsibility is, if your motor carrier calls you up, whether or not you're a hired driver or somebody who's leased on, they call you up and they say, hey, Sam, you need to go in for a random drug screen. You need to follow their instructions and proceed immediately to the collection facility. The immediately means that every action that you take from that point forward, you're working towards getting in there. It's better to kind of go in and do what they need you to do than suffer the consequences. Because if you refuse, that's ultimately the same thing as a positive drug screen, and that sends you down a long headache of a road.
We'll talk here in a minute about those consequences. But what about the motor carrier? We talked about the motor carrier just a little bit. And they really have more to do than just call the driver and say you've been pulled, don't they?
Oh, yes. Motor carrier holds the majority of the responsibilities in these kinds of situations. They're the ones that are subject to audit. They're the ones that have to ultimately answer in a DOT audit. They have to have a specific company policy stating specifically they want their company to be ran.
That has to be a written policy, doesn't it?
Correct. Yes, sir. It's got to be something that they can show in a DOT audit and basically show in their documentations, too, if something of a drug and alcohol testing nature comes up, how they've executed and documented what their company policy means, and basically showing a timeline is ultimately what the DOT wants to see, too, in an audit.
And I know if you've listened to our program on the new entrant safety audit, and even though that's really about a guy who's just gotten their own authority, it talks about what kind of paperwork that needs to be on the files. You have to have the files about when the person was pulled. You have to have a file about what consortium they're in.
Exactly.
The test results. There is just a lot of paperwork that motor carrier is responsible for, and it has to be available for any audit.
Correct. The consortium does send the motor carrier, their MIS reports, the semi-annual reports, things of basically the reporting nature that are just record-keeping things the motor carrier is required to keep on file. Same with drug and alcohol testing. Any drug or alcohol test done for a driver has to be kept on file. A negative is kept for a year, and positives are kept for 5 years.
Another one of these titles that is responsible for some stuff anyway is a D.E.R, Designated Employee Representative. And I know every driver has to have one, but I have no clue what that is. Amber, what's a D.E.R?
A designated employer representative is just a representative of the company. It's the person who's ultimately responsible for sending a driver in for a random drug screen.
Well, I thought that's what the motor carrier did.
Well, it kind of is. The motor carrier has a D.E.R. They've designated that employee. It can be their spouse. It can be their office manager, essentially somebody to handle those records for them, to handle contacting the driver, somebody who knows when that driver is going to be in, when that driver is going to be out, where they're at, the best times to send them in.
So it's kind of a middle person. If I get pulled for a drug test, the consortium is going to tell my DER, and the DER is then going to tell me.
Yes, the DER will then notify you when you need to go in, where you got to go, all that good stuff.
I guess the reason for that is that DER knows if I'm under load and that I'm going to, it's going to take me a couple of days to where I can even get to where I can do a test.
Right. She knows your schedule, or he knows your schedule, knows if now's a good time. You may be under, an oversized load, and so you physically can't stop any right now. She knows that, and so she's not going to advise that, hey, Sam, you need to go in and take a drug screen right now. She's going to wait till you're out from underneath that load, and it's a better time for you to go in. So it kind of makes things a little bit easier for everybody.
Now, as a driver, I have to report as soon as that DER tells me. So the DER can't say, well, you've been pulled and in 4 days you're going to be back.
Right. No, they have to let you know as soon as it's time for you to go in. The regulations state that you are supposed to go in. You're not supposed to have any kind of notice. It's supposed to be random. And if somebody gives you a 4 days notice, it's not really random anymore.
Okay, what about the DER? Is there any kind of training or anything they have to go through?
They do have to have what they call a supervisor's training at 60 minutes on drugs, 60 minutes on alcohol. Just kind of covers what you have to look for as far as, if a driver comes in and they're suspected to be under the influence of any kind of drugs or alcohol, different things for them to look out for. So they do need to have that supervisor's training. There's a certificate that they would need to have on file at the motor carrier's office. I know CMCI's program, we do provide a CD to all of the motor carriers with DERs for them to kind of listen to and get the training that they need. And another thing, Tom, for the DERs, as far as a responsibility that they have, is anytime the M.R.O. has a verified positive, they in turn notify the consortium. The consortium will in turn notify the DER that, hey, this driver has tested positive. This is what they've tested positive for. It will be the DER's responsibility to essentially remove the driver from safety-sensitive functions or remove him from driving from the truck. The moment that he has a positive, he's no longer allowed to perform any safety-sensitive functions.
So it's the DER's responsibility to get that driver out of the truck.
Yes.
Now, you made the comment about an M.R.O. What the heck is an M.R.O.?
An M.R.O. is a medical review officer. Basically, he's the doctor that says negative or positive. He verifies the lab results and signs off on them. He reports those test results, whether they be negative or positive, to the consortium, and the consortium deviates from there, whether we notify an owner-operator directly of a positive or if we have to notify the DER about a hired driver positive.
So the M.R.O., that's the doctor who interprets the test results.
Correct. And without his signature, it would not be considered a valid DOT drug screen.
Does he contact the driver directly, or does he contact the DER, or is he obligated to contact the consortium? How does this contact take place?
Typically, the M.R.O. will report directly to a consortium, but that M.R.O. has a responsibility if the test comes up and there's something a little funky in there, something doesn't seem right. There may be even prescription medications that the driver's on. That M.R.O. has a responsibility to contact that driver and verify any prescription medications that he's on. As long as it's a valid prescription in that driver's name, it wouldn't be considered a positive test. It might come up positive to begin with, but as long as that M.R.O. does their due diligence, it'll be corrected in the end and come out as a negative.
And we're going to touch on that a little bit later on in one of the other parts to this series. But basically what it is, you may be under a prescription that normally would be illegal. So you go in, take your drug test, you test positive, but if you can prove you have a prescription for it, the M.R.O. will pass you anyway.
Exactly. As long as you have a valid prescription and the doctor is aware of your occupation and still prescribes you that medicine, it's okay to take.
Okay, we made it sound a lot easier than it is, and we're going to cover that a little more in depth in another program.
Yes.
Okay, the M.R.O., if they notify you that there's been a positive test, whether it's you or a driver who reports to you, once that report comes in and you need to get that driver out of the truck, then you need to get the substance abuse professional, or what's called the S.A.P, involved.
Correct. Yep. Another acronym word, substance abuse professional. Basically, it's a doctor or a counselor, somebody who is DOT qualified. They've gone through the qualifications in order to be certified for DOT positive test. The S.A.P counselor will have the driver come in, do an evaluation of the issue. If it is something that the S.A.P counselor sees to be, of more of a process, they need more training, whatever their evaluation is, they have to follow that evaluation through the whole process. That S.A.P counselor to that driver is ultimately giving them direction in order to get back in compliance.
He's just a counselor to help them through their problem.
Exactly. They are really good at what they do, and they'll be able to tell if you're just a weekend warrior or if you are a chronic abuser and user. These S.A.P counselors are programmed to find things like this. They're required also to do a face-to-face with you. It cannot be over the phone. It's got to be a face-to-face evaluation. They will do their initial evaluation. They'll give you a recommended course of treatment. Once you follow that course of treatment, that S.A.P will actually call you back in and do another evaluation with you, a follow-up evaluation, to make sure you've complied with everything he's put forth for you to do. If he's satisfied with that and you have made every effort in order to be back in compliance, that S.A.P is the only one who can give the okay, it's okay to return him to duty. It's basically that follow-up evaluation is the okay from the S.A.P counselor to give that driver the return to duty drug screen. Once that return to duty drug screen comes back with a negative test result, that driver's considered back in compliance and able to perform again.
Okay, let's be clear. Once you get a positive test, you're out of the truck.
Correct.
And it doesn't matter how long this counseling takes, you're not going to be driving throughout the whole process.
Exactly. You will not be driving at all throughout this whole process. Once you have that positive, that motor carrier pulls you out of the truck, you're out of compliance at that point and unable to perform any safety-sensitive functions. You are not to change the oil. You are not to change the tire. That's it.
And once the S.A.P counselor deems that you've corrected your issues, you're going to have to go back in and take another test, right?
Correct. Yep. That'll be the return to duty drug screen. The return to duty drug screen is basically a typical drug screen. It's a few minor things that'll happen. It's one of the tests that is required to be directly observed. I know we'll go into that a little bit more with the direct observations because there's quite a plethora of things that will go into the direct observation. But ultimately, that S.A.P counselor is going to be your guidance back into compliance.
Okay, what's this take? 4 weeks? 2 weeks? How long does it take?
It can take anywhere from 4 days to 4 weeks to 4 months. It really depends on the S.A.P counselor. They're required to do a minimum amount of things, but just like with all the FMCSA regulations, they can add to them. So the minimum amount of things that they're required to do could take 4 days to 4 weeks. It really depends on that specific S.A.P counselor. They're going to charge different. They're going to make you do different things. And, kind of like a regular doctor. Each one of them is a little bit different. Before you get in with the S.A.P counselor, too, it's very important to know once you're in with the S.A.P counselor and you've signed over and you've given them money, that S.A.P counselor, you have to stick with that same one throughout the whole process. So it's really good if you do have a positive, you're going to keep that driver on. He's going to go through the S.A.P and have the evaluation done, do the process. It's a really good idea to shop around before you just jump in and have it done.
Okay, let's talk about that shop around. Is the S.A.P counselor assigned by the M.R.O, or how do I find a S.A.P counselor?
Various different ways. They can be advertised, internet, radio, magazines. Typically, the one OOIDA and CMCI gives out most is an S.A.P list.com. And all of those S.A.P counselors on that S.A.P list.com are guaranteed to be DOT qualified.
So there's a website you can go to. It's sap.com.
SAP list.
saplist.com. And you can go through there. You can find one that's close to you or whatever.
Exactly. They go by zip codes, area codes, or you can even, if you have a preference of a S.A.P counselor that you know of, you can use them as well. The only stipulation is they must be DOT qualified.
And I know, it depends on where you live. There may only be one close to where you're at.
Exactly.
But if there's more than one, it's always a good idea to talk to them and find out what the fees and charges are going to be.
Exactly. They're all required to do the same amount of things. The only things that are different is the length of time the program is for you, the things that they're going to have you do, and how much they're going to charge you to do them. Those are the three main variables between S.A.P counselors.
Okay, you just mentioned that there's a website we can go to find the S.A.P counselors. Is there also a website to find consortiums?
Not really. Google is, of course, a good search engine to always go to. Just type in, DOT, Drug and Alcohol Consortiums, kind of see what you come up with. Word of mouth, advertising, look in Landline Magazine, call OOIDA. Of course, we have our consortium. But there's really not a website out there that lists all of the consortiums.
And I know there's a lot of them out there, and they're not all the same, are they?
They're not. When you are looking at consortiums, make sure you're looking apples to apples, oranges to oranges. There's CTPAs or consortium third-party administrators, and then there's also CTPA intermediaries.
Okay, I know you know what all that means, but let's slow down and let's explain. What is that?
A CTPA intermediary essentially kind of does a little bit more for you, hence they've got the extra name on the end. They house your paperwork for you. They store it. If the collection facility is taking a while to get the drug screen results back for you, your CTPA intermediary will step in and start making those phone calls to make sure that you're getting your results in a timely fashion.
Don't all the drug consortiums do that for you?
They don't. Just a regular CTPA or a regular consortium, they essentially just handle the random generation for you.
They just pull a test and say you've been pulled.
Right. That's exactly it. They'll pull it, say, hey, you know what, this driver's been pulled. This is where you need to go, and then everything falls on you to take care of it. So when you're looking at them, make sure you're looking at exactly what they do for you, exactly what they offer. A lot of times intermediaries will also offer extra benefits and services. They'll have connections with M.R.Os. They'll have a bigger collection network for you to be able to go in and get your drug screens done.
Now, I've heard rumors, may not be true, but the rumors I've heard are the price that you're charged really doesn't necessarily go along with the services that they render.
That can happen. The price can vary significantly. CMCI's is $125 a year. That includes all of the random tests, as to where other programs may only charge you $40 a year, but then you have to pay for each individual test. So you're looking at $65 to $85 for a drug screen, plus $35 to $45 for an alcohol test, and that could be done 4 times a year. So when you look at the cost, make sure you know exactly what you're getting, exactly what your consortium is going to provide to you. Because in the beginning, it may seem a whole lot cheaper, but when you look at it, I could get selected for 4 drug and alcohol screens, you got to add all of those costs in.
And I know you work with CMCI, and I know that's the one you're familiar with.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about it just for a second. We're not advertising for them, but we know them well. How much is it per year just to be in the program?
It's $125 per year per driver.
And that would include the testing for anything except like pre-employment or post-accident?
Right.
And so if I'm pulled for 4 tests, I'm not going to pay more than that $125?
Nope. All of those random drug screens are covered under that initial fee.
And once the tests come out, who keeps all the records?
CMCI will house all of those records for you, as well as sending you out a copy. So you have a copy to maintain in your office, and then CMCI will maintain a copy here.
So if I lose mine and I get audited, all I need to do is make a phone call.
Right. Yep. You can call us and we'll be your backup.
And there are drug consortiums out there that charge a lot more that do not do as much.
There are. I've heard some outrageous prices in the past, and it just it shocks you to know how much people can charge for this service.
I actually talked to a driver the other day that was paying considerable more just to be in the consortium, and that did not include any test, and he had lost his paperwork. That's why I mentioned that a minute ago. And they didn't have a record of it.
I'd believe it.
Just to be clear on the pricing for the CMCI program, for a motor carrier with drivers, it is the $125 per driver per year to be enrolled into the program. There's also a $110 one-time enrollment fee for the motor carrier that we put forth as well.
So that $110 is you pay it one time, you don't pay it every year.
Exactly. It's a one-time fee, and it's inclusive of all of your training materials. It's going to give you your 2 60-minute training CDs. It's going to give you your cab cards, your post-accident kits, basically everything to prove that you're part of a random program. The pricing does get a little different for an owner-operator running under his own authority. Instead of the $125 a year, we do have a price increase. It's $150 a year. Basically, the difference is the notification that the consortium has to make to an owner-operator direct versus a consortium making direct contact with a D.E.R. or the motor carrier to notify of a driver being chosen for a random.
And what about that guy running under his own authority? Does he have that $110 initial fee too?
Yes.
So it's $110 to get into the program, and then $150 per year after that.
Correct. Yes, sir.
Okay, Rachel, I know we're just about out of time here, and so we need to get off the air, but let me ask one more question. Because everybody has to go to a DOT qualified physician to get their DOT physical, does that also include a drug test, or is that connected in any way?
Not necessarily. The only similarities are you do have to urinate in a cup for both. DOT physical urine is tested for medical purposes, and a DOT drug screen urine is tested for drugs. They're not one and the same.
Okay, so if you get pulled for a drug screen, you're not going to do your DOT physical at the same time?
No. Not necessarily.
Okay, it looks like we're completely out of time. If you've got any questions or comments about this program, or if you'd like a certificate of completion for this program, just send us an email to businesseducation@ooida.com. And don't forget to tell us which program you're referring to. Also, please remember to give OOIDA's Drug Consortium, CMCI, the opportunity to earn your business the next time you're looking for a drug consortium. They can be reached on their direct line at 800-288-3784. You'll be glad you called. We hope you'll join us online again for additional programming in the OOIDA Business Education Series. This series has been designed to give serious business education to truck drivers who take their business seriously. And don't forget, OOIDA has been fighting for the rights of all truckers since 1973. You can join the fight by becoming a member of our organization. Give us a call at 800-444-5791.